Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Successful Farming Podcast. Thanks for listening. This is show number 2. I'm Jason Meeker, and I'm the host of the show. I've got a special treat today. In today's show, we're going to have retired Successful Farming business editor Dan Looker. For years here at Successful Farming, he was our expert in the Farm Bill, in farm business, policy, government, all kinds of interesting subject matter that Dan reported on while he was here at Successful Farming. He retired about a year ago, and just because he's retired doesn't mean that he's unplugged from agriculture and reporting on it. So he's got a lot of things to talk about, and we're going to hear from him in just a moment. Today's program is brought to you by Acuron Herbicide from Syngenta. To learn more, visit acuron-herbicide.com. While you're there, hear firsthand accounts of how Acuron stopped tough, resistant weeds in their tracks and made sure they never came back in the Acuron Chronicles podcast series. Welcome back to the Successful Farming Podcast. I'm here with Dan Looker. Welcome to the show, Dan. Thanks for coming in today.
Yeah, it's good to be back at the Successful Farming offices.
So I wanted to start off asking you about your career. You've been retired, about a year now?
Just a little over a year. I retired in early October last year.
Okay, and we're recording this on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, 2016, so that'll give listeners a little bit of perspective when we delve into some current issues that when they listen to this, they'll know when it was recorded. But so tell me about your early career in agriculture. How did you get involved in ag journalism, in writing for?
Well, I was working for an urban weekly newspaper, the Omaha Sun, in the 1970s. It was owned by Warren Buffett, and I came across the work that was being done by the Center for Rural Affairs, which at that time was located in Walt Hill, Nebraska. It's now in Lyons, but they're both towns are up in the northeast part of the state. The center is a nonprofit organization. One of its roles over the years has been to advocate on behalf of family farmers and small to mid-sized farm owners and operators. And at the time, the center was doing some interesting work that I thought was good business reporting or good economic reporting. They were looking at absentee investment in confinement hog production, which was they were years ahead on their interest in that subject. And they were also looking at investment in center pivot irrigation in marginal land in Nebraska, not so much the center pivots that are used by family farmers in the Platte Valley and elsewhere, but at the time, this was just as the land boom was heating up in the 70s. People were buying cheap land on the fringe of the sandhills and putting down a well and center pivot, and then trying to farm it for a while and sell it and make a lot of money by converting pasture land to supposedly productive farmland. A lot of it really wasn't that productive. Right. So at any rate, I went there and I worked with the center for about a year on a 1-year grant, and got to help on another project they did looking at changes in ownership in banks in Nebraska, and rural banks, which is another very important part of the agricultural economy. And I just really enjoyed what I learned there, and after I had been there for maybe 3 months after my 1-year grant ended, right. They didn't really kick me out the door, but I finally had to find another job, and I went to a daily newspaper in Owensboro, Kentucky, and was hired to do part-time reporting about agriculture. I covered agriculture, labor, and business. And so one day you'd be covering a strike, and the next day you'd be writing about how the crop was doing.
Okay. So then when did you end up here in Des Moines at Successful Farming?
Well, for a few years I was kind of an itinerant journalist. I'd apply for a job after working one place for a year or two, and was kind of working my way up, I guess. And I had a chance to work for Rodale Press for a while as a managing editor there for the New Farm magazine, which was about sustainable agriculture and organic farming. I came back from Pennsylvania to the Midwest. I worked for the center one more time for a couple of years, and then I was offered a job as the farm editor for the Journal and Star in Lincoln, Nebraska. Okay. And this was in 1983, at the start, just as the farm debt crisis was getting worse. And I spent 5 years there doing some really interesting reporting, and it was heart-wrenching to talk to farmers and farm families about their experiences. It was also interesting to see some of those center pivots that had been plunked down at the edge of the sandhills being hauled off and sold as used pivots, and the land being up for sale because of the farm debt crisis. And then I moved from Lincoln, Nebraska to Des Moines, Iowa to work as their agribusiness writer for about 4.5 years. And
that was at the Register?
Okay. I'm sorry. At the Des Moines Register.
I thought so.
I shouldn't forget that name. It was a wonderful paper then, and it still is a very, very good paper. And so I was privileged to work there for about 4.5 years. And then I got an offer to work for Successful Farming in October of 1992, and it's really been fun to move from a newspaper where they cover agriculture from a little different perspective. Lots of times farmers love to cuss the Des Moines Register, to come to Successful Farming, where anytime you visit a farm, people will tell you that they've been reading Successful Farming for generations.
Right. Before I ask my next question, I just want to remind our listeners that today's program is brought to you by Acuron Herbicide from Syngenta. To learn more, visit acuronherbicide.com. While you're there, hear firsthand accounts of how Acuron stopped tough, resistant weeds in their tracks and made sure they never came back in the Acuron Chronicles podcast series. So, you've been retired about a year, and what have you been doing in your free time?
Well, besides wasting some time, I still had a chance to do some freelance writing for Successful Farming. I've also been working part-time for the Iowa Agriculture Water Alliance, which is a nonprofit group funded by the Iowa Soybean Association, the Iowa Corn Growers Association, and the Iowa Pork Producers. Okay. And their goal is to encourage adoption of the practices that are needed to put the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy into effect. In other words, they're encouraging people to adopt practices that will reduce nitrogen and phosphorus in Iowa's waterways.
Trying to get them to get on board voluntarily rather than
right.
have it legislated upon.
Right. And there really is a lot going on in that area. A lot of groups are working very, very hard to move that along. And we've gone from almost no acres with cover crops to about 550,000. But, the estimate is that we're going to need maybe 10 million or 20 million acres if it's going to be enough to capture that nitrogen in the cool seasons. When we have corn growing, it certainly uses all the nitrogen that's there, virtually all of it. But it's that spring and summer when we lose some of the nitrogen that's a lot of it's just native nitrogen in the soil. But that's the source of some of the water quality issues we have here in Iowa.
Okay, so let's talk about some water quality issues a little bit more then. You mentioned cover crops, and we've heard of bioreactors and buffer strips and buffer zones and some of these things. What are some of the things maybe folks don't know as much about that are going on in that area, or is there advancements in some of those areas that we should be aware of?
Not really. Those are the main ones. There are actually some things that make it harder for farmers to do some of those things than you might expect, especially if you want to get support from the USDA, from the Natural Resources Conservation Service. It may take more planning than farmers are interested or able to do. You've got to get you may have to have a whole farm nutrient management plan. and people may or may not want to do that. And there are some other glitches too that make it a little harder to get support for some of the so-called edge of field practices too, like the saturated buffer strips, so most of the farmer interest does seem to be in cover crops because there is some benefit to the farm. It may not be an immediate increase in yields over time. It seems to make the soils more resilient, basically more fertile by increasing organic matter and humus. But that's a very, very slow long-term process.
Right.
And so the expense of doing that can seem daunting when you've got $3 a corn.
Yeah, definitely.
But there's interest. It's continuing even in a year like this one. There was a strong sign up for Iowa's own cost share program. Iowa also has one through the Water Quality Initiative, and it's a little less bureaucratic than the USDA programs, but it also doesn't last as long. You can get a longer term commitment from the NRCS.
All right. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Ag Bankers Conference that you attended recently.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that conference and where it was, what it was about, what you might have learned.
Well,
there.
This is the every year there's a National Agricultural Bankers Conference, and it's a part of the American Bankers Association. It's supported by the ABA, and in this case, the Indiana Bankers Association. It was held in Indianapolis. And I don't know the exact numbers, but I think they had a record or near record turnout. It was very well attended, and there was a lot of focus, as you might expect, on where the ag economy is headed, land prices, commodity prices, this would not have been news to anybody at the conference, but recent reports by the Federal Reserve and others who keep track of the soundness of lenders has shown, a slight increase in loans that aren't considered strong, and so the things are looking a little shakier in the farm lending, but it's nothing like the 1980s yet. And but some of the speakers did focus on that. Their keynote speaker was Jason Henderson, who runs Extension at Purdue. But before that, he was running the Omaha branch of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. And the Omaha branch focuses on the farm, on agriculture and the farm economy. Jason's an economist. And so his talk was basically about whether we're heading into another 1980s or not. And he said it was actually similar to the 1970s at this point, where we have declining farm income. It's gone down maybe 30% the last 3 years currently, and in the late 70s it went down about 38%. And Jason had a nice graph showing that. And then in the early 80s it continued to go down. There were some big differences that were discussed later in the conference too, especially when people were talking about land prices. But the land price run up in the 1970s was driven a lot by inflation. It was more speculative than what we've seen recently. Up until 2 or 3 years ago, land prices were going up just because the farm economy was doing so darn well, with $7 corn and the ethanol boom, and so most farmers are not as highly leveraged as they were in the 1970s. Still have quite a bit of equity, and but there are cases where people, may have spent a little more on machinery or expansion or buying land than maybe they should have in hindsight. You just never know about those things. But a few people are there are people who've already gone out of business, and a few more probably will.
Right. I was a child, I was when in the 80s when the farm crisis hit, having family who were affected by it very deeply. I'm remember it, and I know one of the contributing factors was international trade. So some of the rhetoric that we're hearing just in the few weeks post-election about trade deals, international trade deals, is that going to be bad news for the farm economy overall, or is it indifferent? What's your take on that?
I guess it all depends on what President-elect Trump does. Mm-hmm. He's already announced that he's going to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, mm-hmm. the TPP.
Right.
Since we aren't in that yet, it hasn't been approved by Congress, then it's really hard to measure exactly how that's going to hurt the ag economy. But that was a topic that was discussed quite a bit at the bankers meeting.
Okay.
And I probably didn't write about it as much as I should have for our website. But
well, now's your chance.
Yeah, now's my chance to talk about it a little bit. Jason Henderson mentioned it. And Otto Doring, who is a farm policy specialist at Purdue, also spoke. And they both said that, especially if we try to retaliate against China, that's our biggest soybean market.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the speakers said that China doesn't really, they export a lot to the U.S., but our agricultural balance of trade with China may be greater, and so if we get into retaliation by China, one of the easiest things for them may be to not buy quite as many soybeans from the U.S. and
right.
maybe more from Brazil.
Right.
It's all a global commodity market, and so they'll be able to get their soybeans one way or another,
mm-hmm.
but that could have a depressing effect on prices, and that was one of the factors in the 70s and 80s too. Is we kind of lost part of that big Russian market that we had early in the 70s, or it didn't grow as much as we thought it would. But Otto Doring also mentioned that even if we have a really strong process of moving recent immigrants out of the country, that I think most people know that would affect agriculture in places like Florida and California because they're so dependent on manual labor, and some of those folks are undoubtedly undocumented. Not
right.
all of them, but but what people forget is that processing in the Midwest
yep.
is largely dominated by immigrants, and some from Mexico, some from Somalia, some
mm-hmm.
legal, some not. I have a neighbor who's from Bosnia, and his father worked in the meat packing industry
right.
when they first came here, and they were all legal immigrants,
mm-hmm.
but. So if there's disruption in that labor supply, that could have some bad effects too. And I guess I'm personally heartened by President-elect Trump's apparent move to more moderation in some ways. I mean, mm-hmm. people have criticized some of his early appointments as being far to the right, but that isn't necessarily going to continue throughout his entire cabinet. And some of the things he's saying and that he's focusing on first, seem more moderate. And it's tough for him too, because he may tick off a lot of the people who voted for him
right.
for those other reasons.
Right.
And there are. The protectionism, has a lot of appeal to both Democrats and Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
Not so much to farmers,
right?
But certainly to rural Republicans who've, lost jobs in manufacturing, mm-hmm. and as much as rural Democrats and even urban Democrats. And in the ag community, I know of only one organization, major farm organization, that has been critical of our trade deficit, and that's the National Farmers Union. And their president, Roger Johnson, makes some pretty good arguments about what that deficit has meant for our economy. It takes a few percentage points off our GDP. So Trump is not crazy to be focusing on that. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, you can do a lot of harm if you don't do this well.
Right. There's a lot of unintended consequences and rippling effects through all parts of the economy.
The American Farm Bureau Federation, all of the commodity groups, virtually all of the commodity groups, have always been strong proponents of trying to open up more trade.
Mm-hmm. While we're on the topic of the new administration, the incoming administration, 2017 is a farm bill year. What, from your perspective, what makes this upcoming farm bill negotiation different than recent or previous farm bills that we may have seen? Is there anything that you can think of that might be a sticking point, or might make it difficult, or might make things go more smoothly?
Well, there are some differences, I suppose. Right now, when we're speaking, we don't really know who the next agriculture secretary is. There have been a number of interesting candidates, and I like a lot of them. Including Don Vilwalk from Indiana, and another person from Indiana, Chuck Connor, who's the CEO of the National Council of Farmer Cooperatives. But Chuck has had a lot of experience in USDA as the second in charge there, and he would be more than qualified. And he was also wrote a column recently where he said that one of the biggest challenges for the agricultural community will be to defend the baseline, which is kind of inside the Beltway jargon for the amount of money that the ag committees have to work with when they write the next farm bill. And they did, the last time around, they took a hit voluntarily. They were trying to do their share with efforts in Congress to reduce the budget or reduce the federal deficit. And the ag committee was the only one that did this voluntarily. They all, the Democrats and the Republicans, all held hands and walked off the plank and together. But so that's going to be a major problem, I think, even though our economy is already growing and the stock market seems to view the election of Donald Trump favorably right now. And so if it continues to grow, you would think the money would be there for that relatively small part of the federal deficit or federal budget that is agriculture. But every time a farm bill is written, the farm programs come under attack, and the Heritage Foundation will be doing that again. And Trump has listened to folks. He's getting advice from people in the Heritage Foundation as well. And you can make a lot of arguments that there's maybe some waste in the ag budget, but not right now. The timing would just be horrible to be making major cuts to farm programs. I won't be at all surprised to see farm groups wanting to see changes in the kind of program we have now, which is kind of a revenue insurance model. It isn't as good as crop insurance, and farmers get paid a year after they've had losses, as opposed to crop insurance. But it's a 5-year rolling average, the so-called Olympic average, where you throw out the highest and lowest years of revenue, and that average is moving downward, so the protection farmers will get is falling. And there was a lot of interest at the bankers conference in how these farm programs work, and then also in getting an assignment of the checks or the money farmers get made to the bank if that farmer has a lot of debt, and but one banker told me they don't count these farm program payments as part of in projected income or cash flow or assets or anything. And part of that, I think, is because the payments are different in each county. Most counties in Missouri and southern Iowa have gotten little or nothing.
Right.
Counties in the northern part of the state have gotten substantial payments. Farmers in those counties. So that uncertainty, I that's not popular with bankers either. So I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of pressure to make changes in how these commodity support programs are run. The easiest thing to do, of course, is just to continue them, and if there's a lot of disagreement, maybe that's what they do. But the other thing is that even though these programs won't be enough to save some farms that are in financial difficulty, they will be expensive when you look at it from a national perspective.
Yeah.
$8, $9, $10 billion for a year or two, and then falling because of this rolling average that's moving downward.
Okay. So shifting a little bit, but not too far, you mentioned a couple of possible names for Secretary of Agriculture. So let's imagine the phone rings, it's Donald Trump, and he wants to know who Dan Looker thinks should be the Secretary of Agriculture. You've mentioned a couple of names you thought would be good, but who do you think should? What are some of the names you think should be? But then who do you think and why? And then who do you think might actually get the nomination?
Well, I wouldn't pretend to know who might get the nomination. I've been reading some of the speculation from about previous ag secretaries, and I think the Washington Post had a report about Tom Vilsack being the choice for President-elect Obama, and they were right. When Bill Clinton came into the White House, there was a lot of speculation about who it might be, and one of the articles I was reading said that it's likely to be a governor. Well, it turned out to be a congressman, Mike Espy.
Okay.
And Espy's name was on the longer list, but I don't think it was on any short list. So I'll be very honest and say that I don't really know who it might be. I'm kind of, the theory that it might be somebody from Indiana is kind of appealing because Governor Mike Pence of Indiana is now the vice president-elect, and he knows a lot of good people in that state.
Right.
And Don Vilsack, as I mentioned, is one of them. Chuck Connor is from Indiana. He has a brother, Mike, who farms in northwest Indiana. Vilsack is past president of the Indiana Farm Bureau and ran for the American Farm Bureau Federation president. And most of the membership of Farm Bureau, I guess a strong majority is from the South. Kentucky and Tennessee have the most members, and a number of other southern states, including Texas, have a lot of members and a lot of influence. So a Southerner wound up being elected, but I think Don made a good run at it, and is pretty well regarded by people in Farm Bureau and people in agriculture. Those two would be among my personal favorites. I think either one would be great. Some of the other people on the list here in Iowa, Bruce Rastetter, is a very, very sharp guy, very successful agribusinessman, and he managed to get most of the Republican presidential contenders to come to Iowa for a forum on agricultural policy. I thought that was remarkable, and I think he certainly understands agriculture very well, and would probably be pretty good at it. The other people mentioned in Indiana are Kip Tom, a very well-known farmer who I believe also farms in South America as well as in Indiana, a very progressive guy. It's been on the speaking circuit a lot.
Yeah.
Had an unsuccessful run for Congress this time around in the primary. A guy named Mike McCloskey, who is co-founder of Fair Oaks Farms, a large dairy that has an excellent agritourism business too.
Okay.
As you're driving north of Indianapolis and West Lafayette, Indiana, on I-65, you go by all these billboards, and it's a very, very popular destination for people in the Chicago and Indiana area.
I don't want to spend too much time on this, just because when people hear this, it might be a moot point.
It may be somebody we haven't even mentioned.
Those are all interesting names, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. So kind of the last thing I wanted to talk about, and maybe the most important thing, is toward the beginning, I asked what you were doing with your time since retirement, and I know you've been doing a lot of bike riding.
That's correct. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your. Just tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. Well, I got started on this when I was probably 11 or 12. I was in what we now call middle school, junior high, in Lincoln, Nebraska. I grew up at the edge of town, spent a lot of time kind of wandering through the University of Nebraska experimental farm, and my buddies and I also used to ride fat-tired coaster bikes out on these gravel roads east of Lincoln. And one day we discovered we had ridden to another town called Prairie Home, and I'm not sure if that's there anymore, but there was a little gas station and shop where we could buy some knee-high grape soda and quench our thirst, and then we rode a little further and to Waverly, where they were building Interstate 80. This was that long ago that there were these slabs of concrete on the ground, and so a few weeks later, we decided to try to ride our bikes up to the Platte River. It was about 30 miles northeast of Lincoln, and we rode up on this slab of concrete that was the unopened interstate, and there was no traffic. A few people driving cement trucks on the other side, on the other slab, kind of waved their fist at us and told us we should get off of the roadway. But we rode up to the Platte and rode back a different route and did about an 80-mile ride on coaster bikes, and we were pretty tired when we got back. My parents took some hot dogs up to. We spent the night at a YMCA camp and in a cabin there, and my folks brought hot dogs up, and we had a picnic dinner. And but at any rate, I have been riding my bike to work, commuting on it all my life, going back to when I was in college. The first year or so I lived at home, and I'd ride my bike down to the fraternity I was in at the University of Nebraska, and my fraternity brothers were amazed that I'd ridden 7 miles on a bicycle. And so today, people's attitudes about bicycling have changed a lot, and I used to feel like the Lone Ranger commuting from my home here in Des Moines to Meredith Corporation, where we publish Successful Farming, and now you see all kinds of people commuting. And so I thought it would be fun after I retired to see how far I could ride. I've gone on RAGBRAI several times. That's the Des Moines Register's annual Great Bicycle Ride across Iowa, which is the largest organized bike ride in the world. They cut it off at 10,000, and sometimes 20 or 30,000 people ride along. So it used to be that in January, when I was biking into work in the cold and in the dark, I had this Walter Mitty dream of pedaling across the Southwest U.S. on a route that's called the Western Express, that was mapped out by a nonprofit group that promotes bicycle tourism called the Adventure Cycling Association. And the Western Express goes from San Francisco to Pueblo, Colorado. It crosses Nevada on US 50, which is nicknamed the loneliest road in America.
Okay.
It really isn't. There are quite a few trucks, as I discovered.
Okay.
But it's a fun route. A lot of old mining towns, and all of the businesses there are virtually all the motels and restaurants are locally owned.
Okay.
These are small towns that large companies aren't interested in, and so we stayed at the Lincoln Hotel in Austin, Nevada, in the middle of the state. For about $50 a night.
Wow.
And it was clean and a small room, and you go over about at least a dozen mountain ranges in Nevada.
Wow.
I think it's more than that, but they aren't terribly high compared to some others. But it's considered one of the more difficult bike routes, but also one of the most scenic. It goes through central and southern Utah. You go right through the north edge of Bryce Canyon National Park, the north edge of Capitol Reef National Park, and it was spectacular. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah,
and my wife followed me in our car as a sag wagon, and one time we met in the middle of the desert in Nevada for a picnic lunch, and had a couple of mountain passes. Usually, though, she would just meet me at the next town.
Gotcha.
And,
so a little different than riding to the Platte.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, there aren't. In western Utah, there aren't any places to buy grape soda or anything else.
Oh,
so there's an 82-mile stretch.
Oh, wow.
With 3 mountain passes.
That's a long stretch in a car. To go without anywhere to stop.
And on the middle mountain pass, I got up to the top of this pass, and there were all these people putting blacktop down, repaving the road, and it was going to get to up to 100 that day, and I felt worse for them than me. And I'm standing there waiting for the woman who's the flagger to tell me I can, they can send the bicycle through, and a guy driving the other way in a minivan stops and rolls his window down and asks if I need any water, and so people. Even though these roads aren't very heavily traveled, I think if you got into a real bind, if you could hold on for a while, somebody would come by and bail you out. But that never happened, fortunately.
Well, that's a lot of fun. I remember when you came into the office and you were talking about going on that bicycle ride. Right. I was like, wow, that's really amazing. That's really fantastic. And
well, and I thought maybe I'd be one of the oldest people to do this. And when we drove the route in Nevada, and stopped at a place called Cold Spring Station and had breakfast there. And I was talking to one of the owners, and I said, "Well, I suppose I'm going to be 69 in August. I suppose I'm one of the oldest people to do this, right?" And he said, "Oh no, we had a guy who's 75 come by here the other day, and we had a guy who was 80 pass through once."
Oh man!
And then when I was riding the route, as I was going over the Sierras, in California on the way to Nevada, I met a guy and his son, and he was exactly my age.
Oh wow!
And he and his son were planning to do the whole route across the U.S. in about 60 days.
Oh.
So,
wow!
I'm very, very fortunate at my age to be able to do this. Not everybody could. Not everybody's in good enough health. But yeah, it wasn't anything all that unusual, I guess. And I'm hoping to finish the rest of the route across the country this spring. I did cross Kansas, eastern Colorado and Kansas in early October, and that was a lot of fun too. And people were very, very friendly.
Okay, well, after your next leg, or once you finish that bike ride up, you'll have to come back and tell us about the rest of it, and then maybe we can also talk about some of the other
right, yeah,
Farm Bill and Secretary of Agriculture, those kinds of things.
Well, when I went across Kansas, I rediscovered farm dogs, which don't, when you're driving up to a farm to interview a farmer, usually that's no big deal, but when you're pedaling by on a bicycle, there's something about their instinct to chase deer and prey that kicks in. So So I'll be glad to talk about the farm dogs of Kentucky and and also the farm bill. To see what's been done with it.
All right. Well, thanks for coming in and thanks for sitting down and talking with us.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, Jason.
Thanks. Well, that's our show today. I'd like to thank once again Dan Looker for coming in and sharing some of his insights into the current state of the farm economy, the upcoming farm bill, the new presidential administration coming in here in January. Hopefully Dan will come back and give us some more great information in a future show. I'd like to invite you to get involved in this show. We're really interested in talking about the kinds of things our listeners want to hear about. So let us know what you think of the show. If you have suggestions for topics or just want to say hello, you can email me at podcast@agriculture.com. You can find information about this show, other shows, our social media contacts, and future episodes and past episodes of the Successful Farming Podcast by visiting www.agriculture.com/radio. I just want to remind listeners that today's episode was brought to you by Acuron Herbicide from Syngenta. To learn more, visit acuron-herbicide.com. While you're there, hear firsthand accounts of how Acuron stopped tough, resistant weeds in their tracks and made sure they never came back in the Acuron Chronicles podcast series. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.